Lectures in History is taking a short break this week. In the meantime, we're highlighting one of C-SPAN's other history-related podcasts, Booknotes Plus. Hosted by C-SPAN's Brian Lamb, Booknotes Plus introduces listeners to a wide range of books and authors. The podcast features both new conversations with historians and writers as well as memorable interviews from the C-SPAN archives. This week's episode spotlights historian Sir Richard J. Evans and his book Hitler's People, which explores the men and women at every level of society who made up the Third Reich.
Sir Richard J. Evans has been writing about Germany and Adolf Hitler for his entire professional life. He was knighted in Britain in 2012 for his service to scholarship. From 2003 to 2008, Professor Evans published a trilogy of the Third Reich with a total of over 2,500 pages. His latest book, titled Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich, will be published in paperback in September. In his preface, Sir Richard, a former professor at Cambridge University, writes, quote, "The individuals who stand at the center of this book range from the top to the bottom, from Hitler all the way down to the lowest of the Nazi Party. There are 22 chapters."
Who first showed you the power of democracy? A teacher, mentor, or neighbor? Now you can honor your hero and support America 250, C-SPAN's 18-month ad-free celebration of 250 years of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate and share your hero on our Democracy Hero Wall. We'll send you a Democracy Unfiltered decal as our thank you gift. Your support powers live reenactments, expert talks, and in-depth founder profiles, bringing history to life, unedited and ad-free. Join us in keeping America's story alive. Donate now at cspan.org/donate. That's cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Sir Richard J. Evans, at the conclusion of your book on Hitler's People, your first line is, "As individuals, the perpetrators whose lives are recounted in this book were not psychopaths, nor were they deranged or perverted or insane, despite the portrayal of many of them as such in the media and the historical literature." Why did you need to say that?
Well, obviously, the clue is in where I say despite the portrayal of them as such, particularly in the years after the end of World War II, there was a tendency to portray all the Nazi leaders and many middle-ranking and lower-ranking Nazis as somehow psychopaths, as deranged, as mentally ill. Otherwise, how can we explain how they committed such terrible atrocities? But that, of course, excuses us. We're normal people. We are not psychopaths. We don't have to worry about the implications of National Socialism for humanity in general. And I think that is the wrong way to look about it. When you start to do what I did, which is to look at the biographies of these individuals, you very quickly realize that they had what would normally be regarded as a normal background. They were not mentally disturbed. And so we have to find another explanation for how they committed the atrocities that they did on an unprecedented scale.
When did you learn how to speak German?
Oh, well, at school, I had French and Latin, and it's like Indo-European languages are like a kind of framework, and you just fill the boxes with different words, and you're learning ones. The rules are the same, and the structure is the same. And I decided to do my doctorate on a subject from German history, because when I did that, German history was kind of waking up after a period of amnesia, trying to forget everything, and was a very, very exciting area to go in. And I got on extremely well with Anthony Nichols, A.J. Nichols at Oxford, who was one of my tutors, and he suggested I do a PhD. So in those days, you could get a grant from the government if you were doing a doctorate, as I was, in economic and social history. It was the subject was the feminist movement in Germany, 1894 to 1933, and they'd paid for me to do two full-time residential professional language courses at the Goethe Institute in Germany. And then, by a huge stroke of luck, Willy Brandt, the chancellor, mayor of Berlin, West Berlin, and a prominent socialist politician, was getting an honorary degree from Oxford, and some enterprising don said to him, "Oh, what about doing something for us then?" And so he said, "Okay, you can have 24 free German language 2-month residential scholarships for your students in Germany." So I got one of those, and it was 4 months, and that was enough. I don't have any personal connection with Germany beyond the fact I grew up on the fringes of East London and was overwhelmed by seeing all the bomb damage. I mean, the rubble had been cleared away, but the houses had not been rebuilt and not restored. And I just wondered, as a young child in the 50s, who'd done all this and why. And that got me interested in modern German history, and then the whole problem of Nazism, and trying to get some kind of explanation as to how and why it all happened.
I counted 24 individuals that you feature in this book,
Yeah.
Hitler's People. If you were going to write a book about anybody but Hitler, which one of these characters do you find the most interesting?
Well, the one I found, I mean, I wrote these 24 biographies, including Hitler, because so much more material has become available, surprisingly, maybe, over the past 25, 30 years. So we can look at them afresh with a lot of new material. And also, for many years after the war, biography was a bit taboo in Germany, because the Nazis had a kind of great man theory of history. And so the historians who I read and got to know during my doctorate all had a social science approach. It's theory, that social theory, that explains it, and not individual pathology. But that all changed in the 90s when people started writing biographies again. And by the time I came to think about this book, there were many biographies, not only two great ones of Hitler by Volker Ulrich, whom I knew very personally, and my friend Ian Kershaw, but each of them in 2 volumes, but also many biographies of Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, many other leading figures. So, as it were, they've been done already, and that's a reason why I wrote this book. It goes back to a famous book published in 1971, which is a terrible long time ago now, by the German journalist Joachim Fest, who is a very competent historian, and I'd modeled my book on his, and there's been nothing like it since Fest wrote his book called The Face of the Third Reich, which is why I subtitle mine Faces of the Third Reich. So I'd probably write Guring, just because there isn't a good modern biography of Guring, exceptionally, and he is a rather extraordinary, fascinating figure.
What's fascinating about him?
Well, the fact that he was regarded, he was a World War I flying ace, although it now looks, I went through some of the really tedious technical literature on World War I flying aces, and it looks as if from that he actually made up some of his, kills, as he calls them, shooting down Allied planes. And throughout, you can see that he's a man who's prioritizes display and image over the reality. So I start off my chapter on Goering with an anecdote about how he used to keep a lion cub on his estate outside Berlin, which he got from the Berlin Zoo, which of course is run by Nazi. And then when he got a bit too big, he swapped it for a smaller one again. generally to impress visitors. And of course, this degenerated later in his life into dressing in increasingly bizarre clothes, dressing as sort of like a Roman emperor, having his nails painted, for example, finger and toenails. And yet he was a very strong character. And when he was weaned off morphine and the drugs which he became dependent on, to dull the pain of the injuries he received in the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, he was weaned off them at Nuremberg by the doctors before he went on trial, and he again was took over, commanded the Nazi accused, those who survived and were in the dock at the Nuremberg trial. So he's a fascinating figure who had a huge thirst for power and was a major figure in the economy, running the four-year plan. He was in nominal charge, at very least, of the Holocaust, of the mass murder of the Jews. He had a mania for collecting art, and he used an agent for this, but he had a big art collection. He was a hunting specialist. I mean, many-sided man, and yet horrible, brutal, murderous, violent, despite his reputation, quite undeserved as being kind of relatively civilized Nazi leader in comparison to some of the people who were thought to be thugs. And incidentally, what I discovered, of course, was that someone like Ernst Röhm, who is the head of the stormtroopers, who portrayed himself as a thug, as a kind of simple military man, in fact came from a middle-class background, and he was quite a competent and amateur pianist. So these images are quite deceptive.
I got to read from your book. This is a quote from Leon Goldenson, who is a psychiatrist, you say, about Guring. And this is what Guring says. Anti-Semitism played no part in my life. If it were on the basis of anti-Semitism, I would never have been interested in the Nazi movement. The thing which attracted me to the party was the political program. I mean, the creating of Greater Germany and the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, if one joined the Nazi party, one had to adopt all the points of the party, more or less, including anti-Semitism. What do you think of that statement?
Well, there are some leading Nazis who clearly were anti-Semitic from the very beginning. So Alfred Rosenberg, for example, a Baltic German who became a kind of self-appointed chief ideologue of the Nazi party. Julius Streicher, who founded and edited the vile anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer, the Stormer. There were many who came into the Nazi party already anti-Semitic, but there were others, and I think Goering is one of them, who fell under Hitler's spell for other reasons, and then began to absorb his anti-Semitism. And so in the end, you find, as I said, Goering is the man who is actually formally in charge of the program to exterminate the Jews in the Holocaust. And there's a horrible, revolting document, which is a set of minutes of a meeting Goering and some of the other leading Nazis held immediately after the so-called Reichskristallnacht, the Reich Night of Broken Glass, dubbed that in the kind of rather bitter humor of Berliners, after the mass pogrom of 9th, 10th November 1938, in which Nazi stormtroopers trashed 7,500 Jewish shops, burnt down hundreds and hundreds, thousands of almost all the synagogues in Germany. And on Hitler's explicit orders, 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and put in concentration camps until they promised to leave Germany, to emigrate. And in this conference, it was about what they were doing was trying to have further legal measures against German Jews. So this is before the war, right? And Goering treats it all as a joke. It's really quite horrible. And they're talking about, for example, whether Jews should have separate compartments on German trains, this kind of thing. It's a very, very unpleasant document, and Goering is quite sincerely a deep-dyed anti-Semite by that time. And of course, like a lot of the other leading Nazis, he lied through his teeth at Nuremberg to try and save his skin.
How did he die?
Well, that is quite interesting because he was condemned to death by hanging. Now, in Germany, hanging was considered a dishonorable death. In fact, it wasn't used in modern Germany at all. Executions were carried out by the guillotine after 1936. And Goering considered condemnation to death by hanging as being an absolute personal insult. And so he demanded to be shot by a firing squad because he considered himself to be a soldier. And this was rejected, obviously. And so he managed somehow to persuade one of the jailers at Nuremberg to smuggle in some poison, which he took just before he was due to be executed, and killed himself, committed suicide. And incidentally, suicide was incredibly widespread. There's a mass wave of suicides at the end of the war. Leading Nazis, middle-ranking Nazis, government ministers, generals. I mean, hundreds of people committed suicide, not to mention more ordinary, lower-level Germans. Because of fear of the Red Army, but also because a lot of them, as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' wife wrote to her son by her first marriage, before she married Goebbels, that they could not imagine living in a Germany without Hitler. It's like a cult almost. It shaped every aspect of their lives. And so she and her husband killed their 6 children, all of whom incidentally had names beginning with H, in honor of Hitler, and then kill themselves.
I noticed in your book, and I wrote it down, that Goering suicide, Goebbels suicide, Himmler suicide, Rudolf Hess suicide, of course, Adolf Hitler in the beginning, and one of the other chapters on Robert Ley, he committed suicide, Hans Frank suicide. It goes on and on.
Yeah,
when they committed suicide, by the way, how did they do it?
Oh, well, it's a huge variety. They shot themselves, poisoned, blew themselves up. There's a wide variety of methods they used.
You have a chapter in here at the end of a woman named Louise Solmitz.
Yep.
Someone, of course, I've never heard of her, but you tell this story for what reason?
Well, because the book is divided into 4 different parts. Part 1 is about Hitler. Part two is about the leading top Nazis like Goering, Goebbels, Himmler. Part 3 is about kind of middle-ranking Nazis, Heinrich, Eichmann, people like that. And then the 4th part is trying to look beyond these leadership roles to more ordinary people. So I have biographies or chapters on what you might call ordinary mass murderers, and then fellow travelers, people who were not fully paid up Nazis. And then finally, Louisa Solmitz, who's a retired school teacher in Hamburg, because she's a very ordinary person and is not a Nazi, but she kept these voluminous diaries. I mean, I've actually handled them and looked at them. 700 pages of closely cramped handwriting each year. She was one of these obsessive diarists, a bit like Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. He couldn't get through a day without writing about it, either in the evening or the next morning. And the problem is it's horribly difficult to read. I mean, people like a man like Himmler had a wonderfully clear handwriting to go with his rather pedantic character, but Louisa Solmitz is really difficult. But there's a very assiduous, determined German historian called Beate Meyer, who has read some of the diaries and found out that a lot about it. Now, Lisa Zomets, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, was ecstatic, absolutely ecstatic. She was a nationalist conservative, thought it was wonderful that Hitler was collaborating with old people who'd survived from the Kaiser's Germany. And over the period from then up to 1945, she gradually became more and more disillusioned with the Nazis. And the most extraordinary thing was that she was married to a Jew, Friedrich Stolmetz. She was not Jewish, but there was her husband, another German nationalist, an old soldier, who even volunteered to fight for Germany, fight for the Nazis in 1939. It was, of course, turned down. And one of the things that caused her to lose her faith in Hitler, apart from the mass destruction of German cities by Allied bombing raids, was the trouble that their daughter got into, particularly when she had a child, because their daughter was classified by the regime as being mixed race, half German and half Jewish, and therefore was denied a lot of rights.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. Did you go physically to where the diaries were, or did you?
Yeah. No, they kept in Hamburg. I had a look at them, trying to decipher them. I'm normally quite good at that kind of reading the old German script, but that was a bit beyond me, really. It would have taken years.
What was the story of the diaries themselves? She gave them up, then took them back, then gave them up.
Yeah. She realized they were a very important, or could be seen as an important historical source. So when she got fairly elderly, she handed them over to the main archive for research into the Nazi period and contemporary history in Hamburg. But she missed them. She could read them, of course. She read them, so she had got them back. And the archivists couldn't read them themselves, which gives me a certain sense of relief because it sort of excuses my inability to read them. She came in and as it were, redid them, or some of the passages, and in so doing, Dr. Myers discovered she softened a lot of the enthusiasm that she had originally expressed towards Hitler and the Nazis.
How many different trials were held after the war was over? I know, obviously everybody knows about the Nuremberg trial, the one with the 22 people in front of it. How many more were held?
There were hundreds, because it's not, first of all, because the U.S. military occupation forces held a series of other trials: the judge's trial, the doctor's trial, the industrialist trial. There were a lot of these trials in Germany. But the rule was, it was decided on, that Nazi perpetrators had to be put on trial in the country where they had committed their crimes. So there are hundreds and hundreds of trials held in Poland, for example, many in France, some in Austria. You look everywhere where Nazis occupied, Italy, for example, and you find there are trials. There are many more than people generally believe. People just usually focus on the trial of the major war criminals in Nuremberg, but there are many hundreds of others. That doesn't, of course, mean that the majority of Nazi perpetrators were brought to trial. The great majority were not.
In your chapter on Joseph Goebbels, you write this: by using derogatory nicknames for his critics, by denying the legitimacy of opposition to his cause, by cynically refusing to accept the truth when it turned out to be inconvenient, and by creating powerful but ultimately imaginary menaces to society that threaten to destroy it unless countered by the power of a supposedly great leader, Goebbels set an example that was to be followed long after his death. What are you getting at there?
So, well, one of the reasons I wrote this book was the rise of real and would-be strongmen and dictators in our own time. And of course, they people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, they don't read books about Goebbels and say, "Oh, that's a good idea. I'll do that." But there's a sort of structural similarities about the way in which people, men, of course, nearly all men, behave when they're coming to power. There's sort of lack of scruple about it, and we live in an age where the truth is under assault. Some people have called it the post-truth age, where social media in particular are spreading all kinds of lies and distortions. And I think we need to reassert the importance of serious scholarly research, of telling the truth, of resting what we say on a careful appraisal of the evidence, and not just, as it were, firing from the hip.
What impact has studying the Nazis and the Germans all your life had on you? How have you changed?
Well, of course, I haven't just written about the Nazis. So I've written a history of 19th century Europe, for example, called The Pursuit of Power. I've written what you might call theoretical and methodological books about how you study history. I suppose the best known is In Defense of History. I've written a biography of the British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, which was very widely reviewed in the UK because he was a well-known public figure and bombed totally in the USA. I think I had 3 book reviews, 2 of which were totally, absolutely hostile and sort of confused the subject of the book with the author, because I'm not a Marxist or a communist as he was. But still, I've written about quite a wide variety of topics. So the how does that all change to me? Well, it's hard to say really, but looking back, it has it has convinced me that democracy is a fragile creature and needs to be fought for wherever we can do that. That's for one thing. I try to keep my faith in humanity, but it's sorely tested by looking at figures like the ones in my book, Hitler's People, who commit the most appalling atrocities, and I actually think they're doing good. I became a friend late in his life of the novelist Martin Amis, who I helped with a book he called The Zone of Interest, which then became a very good movie, in fact. And in his book Time's Arrow, it's an autobiography of a Nazi perpetrator, kind of carries out medical experiments. And it's told backwards. It begins with his death and then ends with his birth. And for Martin, and we discussed this really, he wants the idea of doing that is because the Nazis thought they were doing good. They thought they were creating things. They thought they were building a better future. And I think we have to be, that sort of comprehensively disproved. I think their vision of the future was just destruction. So those, but on the other hand, I'm writing, going to write and trying to write a book, a sequel to this one called Hitler's Enemies, where I want to show how people did resist in Germany in particular. They did not fall under the Nazi spell, and maybe that will give me a more positive view.
How do you work? In other words, do you work in your home? Do you write on a computer? How do you keep all of this material straight?
Well, I have, I don't know if you can see my bookshelves. I've got a lot of books. There's the view outside my study where I sit is of the rolling hills of North Hertfordshire on the borders of Cambridgeshire. It's a very beautiful area. I sit at my desk, and quite frequently I go to Cambridge University Library, which is quite close by. It's 15 miles away. And that is one of the world's great libraries. It's a copyright library, so it gets a free copy of every book published in the UK, and it has the resources to buy huge numbers of books in German, for example, and get almost anything I want, really. And also, after the war, the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, had amassed a collection of Nazi literature, which it wanted to, in order to help inform itself about the Nazis. And after the war, that was no longer necessary. And so they donated it to the university library. So you can find all kinds of things there, including things like the original catalogue of the notorious Nazi exhibition called Degenerate Art, for example. That's there, in the library. So, and a lot of these books, a lot of secondary literature, you can borrow from Cambridge. So I have the resources.
In 2000, a famous trial was held about David Irving suing Penguin Press and Deborah Lipstadt for her book. And you were an expert witness. How did that happen that you were a witness? And what was that like?
This is the year 2000, and it all goes back to 1994, when Deborah Lipstadt, an American historian based in the Holocaust, the growing assault on truth and memory, and when that was published in the UK, the libel laws in the UK are much more generous to plaintiffs and complainants than they are in the US. We don't have a presumption of free speech as is enshrined in the Constitution in the US in the First Amendment. We don't. If you're suing somebody for libel in this country, you essentially have to prove, if you are sued, that you can prove a number of things, but you're kind of guilty until you're proven innocent. It's ridiculous. And so when Mr. Irving, who's a writer on World War II and the Nazis in particular, not a professional historian and never held a university post, but he sued Deborah Lipstadt because she'd called him a Holocaust denier and a distorter of historical evidence. And so it was decided to fight this by Lipstadt's and Penguin Books defense team through what's called justification, which means, it's a libel, it's a defamation, but it's true. And so they engaged me as the main expert witness. I had a couple of students working as assistants to me, my PhD students, and they were, we all went through Irving's writings. You've got a court order making him to disclose his private correspondence, his research notes, all kind of huge mass of material. Anthony Julius, who is the man who ran the defense, as an intellectual, as well as a lawyer, he'd written a famous book about T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism, the poet T.S. Eliot. And so he had copies of my books on his bookshelves, and obviously there were extensive discussions who to ask, but they asked me, and of course, Anthony Julius said, it'll be easy, it'll be 3 months, it's not going to be difficult, but of course it was, because I had to spend 3 years on the whole thing, and I think it was not difficult at all proving that Mr. Irving was a Holocaust denier, and we agreed on the definition of the Holocaust denier at the beginning. But going through his work was tracing back the distortions, putting words into documents and quotes which weren't there, taking out words that were there, rearranging the timelines, all kinds of things. And that took a lot of very detailed research. We had help from archives all over the world, from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, from the Berlin major state archives, from Washington, D.C. It was a big international effort, and I was very proud to have taken part in it. And there is a movie made about it called Denial, starring Rachel Weisz, Timothy Spall, and Tom Wilkinson. And I can actually recommend it. It's pretty. The screenplay by David Hare, and I've discussed it with him, is pretty true to the spirit and the letter of the trial. And incidentally, it's sometimes extracts are shown to law students because it has a very clear explanation of the difference between UK and US libel law.
Now, the judge found him guilty?
Mm-mm-mm.
No?
No. He was Zurich. He was
Right.
He was on the attack. It's very easy. It's very easy to make that mistake because the tactic of a defense, and we had one of the leading counsel in the UK, Richard Rampton, experienced libel law, and the what you do is to prove the defense, so defense against the accusation that you're telling lies about somebody, essentially, is you repeat the original libel and you back it up with huge amounts of research and evidence, and you turn the tables. And Irving felt this, so after a couple of weeks, he complained to the judge that it seemed almost like he was on trial, but it wasn't. Of course, he was the one who was bringing the accusation. If he'd won, there would have been Penguin would have had to withdraw the book and promise not to publish anything like it again. Lipstadt would have had to pay exemplary damages, and it would have been a disaster for freedom of speech. So
did he have to come up with any money?
The total costs of the trial were just over £3 million. And that the first $1 million was paid by Penguin Books Insurance, because all publishers insure against libel. The second $1 million by the multinational publishing corporation, Pearson Longman, that owed the Penguin, and then the rest is paid by fundraising efforts. As soon as costs were awarded against him, Mr. Irving declared himself bankrupt, so he never paid a penny.
But he did go on to Austria and was convicted and put in prison.
He had a previous, there's a law against Holocaust denial in Austria, as there is in Germany. And he'd been convicted in absentia, in his absence, of Holocaust denial in Austria. But he rather foolishly agreed to go back there after the trial on the invitation of extreme right-wing group of people. And was arrested and sentenced to 1 year in prison. And he was allowed one telephone call a day. And who was the first telephone call he made? To the BBC. It's about publicity.
I gather, if the information is correct online, that he is alive and about 87 years old.
He was born in 1938, yes. According to all accounts, he's not very well.
In your book, now this goes to the subject matter that's throughout the book. We haven't talked about it at all, but I want to read it again. This is from a speech in October of 1943 by Heinrich Himmler, and it goes like this. Sorry to read this stuff, but it's the best way to get to the meat of it. The sentence, "The Jews must be exterminated," with its few words, gentlemen, is easily spoken. For the man who has to carry it out, it is the absolute hardest and most difficult that there is. We were confronted with the question, what about the women and children? I decided to find an absolutely clear solution here too. So I did not regard myself as entitled to exterminate the men, in other words, to kill or have killed, and leave their children to grow up as avengers upon our sons and grandsons. The difficult decision had to be taken to let this people vanish from the earth. For the organization that had to carry out this task, it was the toughest that we had so far. It has been carried out without, as I think I can say, our men and our leaders suffering damage in spirit and soul. Why, Heinrich Himmler, quote in your book, who was he?
Himmler was the man in charge of the Holocaust, of the kind of day-to-day operation planning and so on. And he was someone who, again, came from a middle-class background. His father was actually tutor to the Bavarian royal family. He came from this solid background, and he ended up by being in charge of Hitler's bodyguard, the SS, which then became a rapidly growing empire under the Third Reich from 1933 onwards. And it's very curious. He gave these speeches in not towards the end of the war, but sort of slightly after the midpoint, to groups of men like the leading generals, leading SS men, and so on. And he was extraordinarily explicit, as emerges from the quote that you read, about what the SS were doing, about the campaign of mass murder they were carrying out, because he wanted to draw in all of his audience to a kind of complicity in it. And there's an extraordinary passage where he says, this is a page of glory in our history that will never be written. In other words, it's got to be kept secret because Himmler knew this was regarded right across the world as a terrible, unforgivable crime. Indeed, when the Holocaust began to be reported outside Germany in 1942, the Allies resolved to that those responsible would be brought to justice, and actually printed thousands and thousands of leaflets saying this, and dropped them by air over Germany. And Himmler was a fanatical disciple of Hitler. Like many of these leading Nazis, he had his life had kind of lost its meaning after defeat in World War One. And in addition, he was too young really to have taken part in World War One. He was born in 1900. And one of the things that you noticed is how young these Nazis were. I mean, they were extraordinarily young, some of them. And so Himmler, middle class, well organized, rather pedantic. He imbibed and absorbed Hitler's anti-Semitism and carried it out without question.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. I went down the list, by the way, especially in this particular group, and Guring, this is when they died, was 53, Goebbels 47, Röhm 46, Himmler 44,
Yep.
Ribbentrop 53, Rosenberg 53, and Speer, he lived to be 76. Why did Albert Speer live to be 76?
Well, Albert Speer was, he described himself the only friend Hitler had. He was an architect, and Hitler was a man who thought of himself as an artist, but he'd been refused entry to the Vienna Academy of Art before World War One. Because he couldn't draw the human head, basically. That's quite significant, isn't it? And he said, well, he was told you should become an architect. So he had a particular interest in architecture. He spent a lot of time planning with his architectural staff, for example, the future of Germany, the future of Berlin and Hamburg and the big cities. And Speer was a young Nazi, middle class, smooth talking, well dressed, urbane, who managed to persuade the judges at Nuremberg that he didn't know about Auschwitz, which was absolutely, look, about how the hell could they believe that? You know, it's extraordinary because it was such a blatant lie. He'd become by a chance Hitler's Minister of Munitions, and he had employed thousands and thousands of slave laborers in the most terrible conditions. Of course, he knew about Auschwitz, and there's evidence that's been discovered that he did. And it was quite extraordinary that he managed to escape the death penalty. But he was a very charming man who managed to persuade the judges and posterity through the book that he wrote after he was released from jail after 20 years in prison, the book he wrote called Inside the Third Reich, which is indeed an intelligent, insightful book about the nature of Nazi Germany and the character of Hitler and so on, but also, of course, is based on this massive lie that he had really relatively not little to do with it. He described himself as a technocrat, seduced by the possibilities of technocracy. But now, of course, more recently, all of this has been researched very carefully, and it's emerged. He was a Nazi. He's ideologically committed to Nazism from the very beginning, and manages to somehow distort and manipulate the evidence to give the suggestion that he wasn't.
Who would you give the award to for the most vicious of all of the people that you've written about here?
Now, it depends. Well, I'm being a bit of an academic here and say it depends what you mean by vicious. But I think inevitably as Hitler himself. I don't think you can plausibly play the what if game. What if Hitler had fallen under a bus in 1930 sort of thing? But it's quite clear. You're already writing Mein Kampf, his mixture of a political tract and autobiography, first published, incidentally, 100 years ago on July 18th, 1925, Mein Kampf. And you can see this love of violence, this visceral hatred of the Jews, of communists and socialists and anybody who opposed it. All of that comes through. And we have the diaries of Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, who, again, is another of these people who couldn't let a day pass without writing about it in detail. Had many, many conversations with Hitler, and it emerges that it was Hitler who drove it all on, who drove the Holocaust and drove the mass murder of Russian, Soviet, Red Army prisoners of war. I mean, 3.33 million of them, it's often forgotten, were murdered deliberately by the Nazis. All of these policies. It seems to me it's pretty likely that there would have been an anti-Semitic regime in Germany had Hitler not come to power, led by the army, but it was nowhere near as vicious or as murderous, as exterminatory, as genocidal as Hitler was and caused it to be.
What was it like to be knighted?
Well, a huge surprise for one thing. Because I'm a member of the Labour Party, and this is a Conservative government. But it's done through a series. I discovered, after it happened in 2012, I ran into the former head of the civil service in Cambridge, as one does. He was a head of a Cambridge college by this time. And I said, well, it's rather strange, it's a Conservative government of David Cameron, and here I am engaged in a very public spat with the Minister of Education at the time, Michael Gove, over the teaching of history. And he said, oh, well, we said we like that. It proves the system is objective, he said. I got the letter from the Cabinet Office, opened it, and there it said, it said the Prime Minister proposes to put you forward for and I was going to get knighthood. And here are two boxes, tick yes, cross for no. So I ticked for yes, because I think it's a tribute to a recognition of the historical profession apart from anything else. And I know that indeed Michael Gove, though we were engaged in a big row, had read and admired my work, especially my trilogy on Nazi Germany. And there's a system of committees in the British Academy and the Royal Society separately, so they put forward names, these learned societies, and so my name had been put forward. So I thought it was a great honour, and I really appreciated it, not just for me, but on behalf of the historical profession. And I was knighted by the late Queen at Buckingham Palace, and you have a big ceremony. There's a lot of them held every year, every few weeks, an investiture it's called, and you get everything from knighthoods, 3 or 4 of them, down to much lower but still significant honours for things like services to disabled in Northamptonshire, or military honours as well, and so on. So you do feel part of a national community, and that was very very heartening. And when you get a knighthood, it's called a knight bachelor. Though I am not, in fact, a bachelor, I have to say. But and you go and they announce it, Professor Sir Richard Evans for services to scholarship, and you go out and you bow to the Queen. And she was very short, so she stands on a kind of platform on a stage, and you kneel. They whip out this little sort of kneeling stool with an armrest and so on. And she whips out this great big sword. It was her father's sword, and drops it onto your shoulder. And then the other one, you have to suppress the impulse to duck. But it's a very blunt sword, in fact. So, yeah, that was very nice. I got a medal to go with the honor. And it's not been and it's very nice to have a knighthood, but it doesn't give me any major advantage in life. I don't think, except once when I was put in a rather inferior hotel room and my wife arrived late and she didn't like it, and so she said to the manager of the hotel, "Oh, you realise it's Sir Richard?" And he bowed, and then we got a better room.
Does everybody call you Sir Richard?
No, people call me Richard, obviously. Or Professor Evans, except for Americans. It's very annoying how they always call you Dr. Evans. All academics and Americans are called doctor, and I really don't like that. They might as well give me a proper title. I've worked hard enough for it.
Go to your trilogy.
Yeah.
Explain that, but I counted roughly 2,500 words, 3 different books over a period, 2003 through 2008.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you do that? And what's in it? What would I get in those books?
Well, first of all, this came about because of the Irving trial that you mentioned. The lawyers for Lipstadt and Penguin Books asked me if I could recommend a big, detailed, major history of the Nazis. And I said, in the end, I thought that I couldn't because the really good ones are out of date and the new ones were not very good. And I had been teaching. It's what we call the special subject. So it's based on documents. To teach history students how to interpret documents, essentially, on Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany is one of the very few subjects on modern Germany where there's an enormous mass of material in English translation. So the students didn't have to know German. And I've been doing that since 1982 is when I first taught it. So I could do it really very quickly. And because I realized there wasn't a good major modern history, of course, as is the way with us historians, I decided to write it myself. So I did. And I could do it quickly, as I said, because I had all the stuff at my fingertips. I had the books on my shelf or in the library. And I do write, much to the annoyance of some of my historian colleagues. I write quite quickly and quite fluently. Writer's block is not something I have ever suffered from.
And if you buy these 3 books, what is it? What's the total learning experience?
Well, I was very strongly influenced as a doctoral student by the French Annales School. It's a school of historians in France who preach the idea of writing total history. You have to write a history of every aspect of a society or a town or a village or whatever. And so I decided to write a total history of Nazism. So it's not just the politics and the personalities, it's also the economy, society, culture, experience, all of those things. And in fact, in each volume, I have different sections for different periods on those subjects. And it was divided. I was originally going to do it in 1 volume, but it soon became clear that it was far too big a subject. Far too much research had been done. And it ended up as 3. And they're divided in up to 1933, which is when Hitler took over. Then up to 1939, where the war began, and then up to 1945. And they're called The Coming of the Third Reich in Power, and the Third Reich at War. So I would hope that readers can get a narrative, an exciting narrative with a lot of human interest in it, with overarching interpretations as well of the Nazi phenomenon. You end up, I hope, by understanding how it, like other totalitarian societies, how it came to affect every aspect of life.
We have to close it down pretty soon on it, but I do want to ask you about the future.
Yeah.
And what you see around the world, and from your lessons about what happened in Germany, both wars, can it happen again?
Yeah, well, not in the same way or the same form, obviously. Mark Twain once said, history never repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And I think that's what we're experiencing at the moment. I think it is very concerning to see, as I said, how fragile democracy is and how easily it's torn down, corrupted, and superseded by an authoritarian regime that deprives people of or severely limits their basic freedoms. So I think that is a problem, and I hope that my books will help people to think about that and how democracies die and what the consequences of a dictatorship are. The book's been translated into Russian and Chinese, Hungarian, and so and they are in fact selling quite well in China at the moment. And I do hope that will help people to come to terms with the rise of corrupt and authoritarian leaders.
We have 50 million Americans that have some connection to Germany.
Yeah, it's the largest single group.
Largest single group in this country.
Yeah.
What do you say to somebody that says they're German and this is a legacy?
Well, in America, they're Americans. I mean, one of the great virtues of American society is how easily it has assimilated vast numbers of immigrants and turned them into all American people. I think it's a very powerful culture, and it's a culture which I think in which there are kind of what you call hyphenated Americans, Anglo-Americans, German-Americans, Japanese-Americans, and so on. But it's always the American part of it that's dominant. There were societies, organizations of German-Americans during and immediately after the war, and they were in a very difficult position, and some of them actually ended up by supporting Hitler and the Nazis. And of course, we know that Japanese Americans were arrested and put into camps for a while because they were not trusted by the authorities. But I do think it's impressive how America's forged an identity for itself out of this millions of people who have been have started with other languages and other cultures and very quickly absorbed American culture. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that.
Which of all your books, some 20 books?
Yeah.
Which one sold the best in the United States?
Well, it's the Third Reich trilogy. That has sold well over 250,000 copies if you tot up the different formats of hardback, paperback, audiobook, electronic book, and so on. That's sold the best, yeah. And of those, it's the first volume, The Coming of the Third Reich, which is currently selling amazingly well for a book that's over 20 years old. In America, selling about 400 copies a week. I'll leave you to explain why.
The title of the book we've been talking about is Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. And our guest, who we've been finding out some good background information, is Sir Richard J. Evans, based in Great Britain. And we thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Very good to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.